further ado, the project we're going to talk about is our project around child-centred diversity in quality early childhood education and care. So the first connection to our presentation this morning is that it was a European funded project. We have also been fortunate enough that it's continued to get European funding. What that might mean in the future, hey, who knows, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. But you will see that we've got a range of different partners here, which are a mix of nursery schools in different countries. So some of you might recognise the names of Truro and Campbell Nursery School, who go to some of the early education events. Co-op Celios actually work in the Reggio Emilia area of Italy, and they provide some of the settings there. And then we also have a range, we've got Early Childhood Ireland as well, who I think I don't need to introduce in this room. And then we have a range of university-based settings. And I have to count on my fingers so I don't forget anybody, that obviously we've got the UK represented, Italy, Ireland, Denmark, Spain and Croatia. Okay, so it's quite a broad-ranging project. And just to kind of give a background to this project, is that Dan and I have had a long-standing interest in what it means to be a professional in early childhood education and care, and particularly in terms of the notion of competences, and that the European framework talks about competences in terms of knowledge, skills and attitudes, as you were saying this morning. And we've long puzzled over what does it mean in terms of knowledge, skills and attitudes, particularly the attitudes part of things, but that's really kind of got us scratching our heads, literally and metaphorically. And part of those discussions has also been that often when we talk about, oh, what do you want a person who works with young children to be able to do and know, that often this notion of child-centred comes up as well. So then you kind of think, okay, we've got child-centred and we've got knowledge, skills and attitudes. How do these pieces of the puzzle start to come together? And our own thinking has actually been that a more helpful framework is to talk about knowledges in the plural, because we would reframe things like skills and attitudes as still being a knowledge in a form. It's just got different structures and different processes of legitimisation than, say, for example, maths as a kind of technical form of knowledge. So in thinking about knowledges and kind of deciding, okay, we're going to talk about knowledges in the plural and the different ways in which people come to know and how they enact that knowledge, we were still left scratching our heads going, but what does this mean in terms of being child-centred? In particular, we're fascinated by the fact that you can travel to different parts of the world and people will say, yes, we must be child-centred in our pedagogical approach, and yet you will have experiences of being in kindergartens in different parts of the world and go, well, this isn't how I would interpret being child-centred. Actually, I feel a bit uncomfortable by this. Why do I feel uncomfortable? And it was those kind of questionings of our experiences of visiting nurseries and kindergartens and preschools and so on in different international countries that kind of led to the development of this project. So our starting point was, what does it mean to be child-centred? We all say it's important in terms of working in early childhood education and care, but what does it mean and what does it look like? And that's what we're going to pick up on today. When we started to look into this, what we realised is that the concept of child-centredness represents the field of early childhood education and care in terms of being a theoretical hybrid. And by that I mean we draw on psychology, sociology, social policy, biology, neuroscience, and the list kind of goes on. So if you think about professional identities as having a kind of some kind of knowledge core, ours is actually very disparate and quite diverse, which I personally think adds a real richness to our professional practice, because we're not in a silo of this is how the world must be, but actually we've got this broad range of thinking. But then when you think about what that means for a professional to come to know how to work with young children, you know, when I talk to my students and say to them, you do realise that you're doing about 22 degrees in one, because you're not just doing psychology or sociology or social policy, you're doing a bit of everything. And actually when you start to think about this, this is a hugely complex profession. If we take that theoretical hybridity and apply it specifically to the notion of child-centredness, what the literature shows us is that broadly there are three different interwoven discourses around developmentalism, being democratic, and romanticism. Now, it's widely regarded that the concept of child-centeredness comes from those romantic origins of the work of people like Rousseau, Froebel, Dewey, Montessori, and so on and so forth. And then it's that kind of image that perhaps we would like to have of we know that children will learn and develop, and that if we kind of support them in that process and allow them to kind of continue on that journey, that it will happen. But there's an element with which I think we could argue that in terms of that romantic notion that children have a kind of trajectory for learning and development, that we've almost shot ourselves in the foot in early childhood education and care, because we said, it's okay, we can support children to learn, and then everyone went, well, prove it. So we were like, okay, we'll prove it. And in came the developmentalism, and we started to track and document children's development in order to show that, look, this is how children develop, this is what's happening. And as we know, and we heard a little bit this morning, that developmentalism gets twisted and manipulated in various different ways by various different people, naming no names, to become about targets and reaching particular ages and stages and prescribed stages of development. But the developmentalism I wouldn't scrap completely. The core of it, in terms of understanding children's development, I think is central to professionalism, and people do need to know and understand that if they're there scaffolding children's learning, what it is that they're doing. But also, I think it's been really important that we've had the incorporation of the democratic perspective as well. And this is the idea that actually children do have voices. Children are active citizens. We don't do development to them. So if you're thinking about kind of knowledge and skills and all of those kind of things, I can give you child development knowledge, but you can't then do child development. You can't just kind of make a child develop, no matter how much policymakers might like us to ensure that happens. But it's that sense that the democratic perspective is very much grounded in the children's rights movements that we heard about this morning. But the difficulty is that what you then have is that if you're the professional, what do you do? How do you guide your professional practice? So you're being told that in terms of child-centeredness, it's got its historic origins in Romanticism, it's been shaped and informed by developmentalism. Oh, and by the way, can you be democratic in your processes as well? What do you do? So there you are with your juggling balls that you're throwing around in the air. And actually, as you start to look further into this isn't a new issue or a new debate. That actually these competing discourses have a history. That, Walkerdine talked about the child-centered paradox, that you've got this potentially liberating pedagogy underpinned by romanticism and democratic perspectives, supporting children's autonomy and individualism. And then in comes the regulatory gaze of developmentalism, where you've got to show and demonstrate the effectiveness of you as a professional having an impact on that child's development. And the difficulty is, as Chung and Walsh have talked about, is within the early years, that lovely history that we heard about earlier this morning, just because you've got new ideas come along, that history doesn't disappear. And that actually for professionals within the sector, what they're left with is trying to, uphold the values that we've got over 100 years worth of pedagogical practice, and yet at the same time contend with what's happening here and now. And so the project became about how professionals negotiate those different discourses, but also how that works in different countries. So, for example, having a country like Denmark and Italy with very different kind of histories and philosophies in their approach compared to somewhere like the UK and Ireland, we wanted to tease out what it is that child-centeredness means in these different contexts, but also how it's enacted. So broadly speaking, we're going to focus today on a little bit about how the different countries negotiated these discourses of child-centeredness. But just to kind of give you an overview in terms of the research that underpins the presentation, there's been a literature review, observations of practice in all 6 of the countries. We've also done a survey of educators in all 6 of the countries around what it means to be child-centred. And there's also been some online training that we've developed as a result of our research. And at the end of the presentation, we'll tell people how you can go about accessing that. And there's also been an evaluation of that training. One of the things that obviously we had to do as part of this project is, having kind of done the literature review and try to understand what child-centeredness meant from that, and then we did these observations, we started to think, oh, actually, as a project team, what does child-centeredness mean to us? So as a mix of academics and people working directly with children, how would we actually want to go about defining this based on the literature that we've looked at and based on the observations that we've started to undertake? So Jan and I joke slightly that we travelled the country doing nominal group technique discussions like we did with you this morning. But what we find is that that's a very useful way to kind of collectively share ideas and then discuss and form agreements on what it might be to be professional, as we were talking about this morning, but also what it means to be child-centred. So as a group, we came up with a series of characteristics of child-centeredness through a nominal group technique process. I think it's worth stressing that because we were interested in the role of the professional in being child-centred, you see that coming through. So reflective, listening and observing professionals illustrates the fact that our interest was primarily around the professionals. My son has challenged us to ask children what it means to be child-centred. If my son was here, he'd be heckling from the back. Which, you know, it's nice and supportive, it's lovely. But anyway, we also had within that this idea of the image of the child, and we were quite excited by the notion of a child being mysterious as well as capable, active and competent. The idea that we don't actually always know the child and they're there to surprise us, and that's one of the joys of working in early childhood education and care, which reflects this idea of recognising their individual uniqueness. The idea that we're sensitive to their needs, that we want to investigate with them through play, that as professionals we will be inspirational and fun. Children's rights was seen as very much central to our ideas and understandings around child-centeredness, but also recognising the place of the environment, the pedagogical environment, and how that supports child-centeredness, that the child is obviously embedded within their family and that we need to be working with families. Again, the notion of play coming through, and also the idea of managing the external factors, which interestingly I think was more prominent for the UK and Ireland than it was for the other countries in terms of policy impacting on practice. So we had these ideas of characteristics of child-centeredness, and now Jan's going to turn to some of the observations to start to talk through what these might look like in practice.
Okay, so this is coming from just one section of the data, the observations that were carried out in each of the countries. And really what we'd like to concentrate on is the way that practitioners were finding different ways of being child-centred. And these different ways were interacting with their contexts. So as well as all the knowledges, there was also the capacity to put those knowledges into practice in the different contexts where they found themselves. And I've gone back here to thinking about the Vygotskian notion, the Vygotskian concept of buds of development, which itself suggests a kind of latent progression, that within children there is this capacity to grow, and it's part, we would say it's part of the practitioner's role to nurture that. And just to go back to the Vygotskian quote, to put it in context for you, it starts with talking about the zone of proximal development, which I'm sure is a familiar concept. Defines functions that have not matured yet, but are in the process of maturing, yes, that will mature tomorrow and are currently in an embryonic state. These functions could be called the buds of development, the flowers of development, rather than the fruits of development. That is, what is only just maturing. And I think overcoming obstacles in an activity with when you're trying to nurture these buds of development and prompt a kind of qualitative transformation that can move the child on to the next step. That's something I've really been interested in as a researcher, but also as a practitioner myself. And when the activity is focused on maturation, in Vygotskian terms, that's what he calls development. But when it's focused on learning, the activity is understood to occur in some kind of a learning relationship. And these micro moments when things are about to change, they're key points in learning relationships. And I think the particular skills that early years practitioners bring is recognising those moments, and having recognised them, knowing what to do. So I'm going to give you 3 examples now from different countries in the project where there were moments of micro moments of change, and the practitioners responded differently, being child-centred but within their own context. So the first example is from Italy, and it was an activity where the children had been asked to make a picture of a wood. They can pick up some items from a big box of natural objects and make their own collage. Ilaria is making her collage by placing all the light objects from the wood near the upper margin of her large sheet of paper, and the other objects progressively below, according to their weight. Therefore, small leaves and small fruit are above the larger leaves and fruit, and accordingly pebbles are above stone. The teacher passes by and comments on Ilaria's work. The teacher had a project that she's intending to share with the children about our surrounding nature, and this was an activity where children could become creative and show their appreciation of nature. The teacher says to Ilaria, she should draw a real tree, otherwise one cannot understand that it's a wood. The teacher says, you've already put this, and points to a piece of bark. You need some small branches. Now, when you first read that, perhaps you wince a little bit. But when you think about it more in the context of the teacher, and the teacher thinking about where the child is going to go, we could argue that the child's response to that activity was clipped. It was constrained. She was trying to turn Ilaria's work into something else. And although her goals had included something about abstraction and creativity, she didn't see the buds of abstraction and creativity in Ilaria's work. But we could argue that perhaps it was the teacher's anticipation of what is to come within the Italian education system, and her awareness of the rights of Ilaria to succeed through the education system, that was perhaps pushing her towards getting Ilaria to produce something that was more acceptable in the next stage. So in a way, was she being child-centred in acting there in the interests of Ilaria, so that she would probably do better when she moved through to the next stage? So hold that one. Now we're travelling to Spain, and this is some children in a Spanish day nursery, aged 12 to 23 months, and it's lunchtime. So we had a very, very rich description of what was happening at this lunchtime, which I would love to share with you word for word, because you could really, at the end of it, almost feel the spaghetti dripping from your own hair. But just a little excerpt here. A 14-month-old girl explores the pieces of spaghetti and sucks on them, and then picks up the fork and explores that as a utensil. She tests the prongs of the fork and the handle, and the educator begins to ask again if the children want more, then proceeds to collect the spaghetti from those who do not. The children help her. So spaghetti starts to appear from different places, because not only is there spaghetti on the table, it's also on the chairs, on clothes, between the chairs, down the children's backs, on their bibs, and anywhere else. The children, the toddlers, they enjoy the task of helping to clear up, and the educator thanks them for their help. So in this example, children are being given a great deal of autonomy during the eating activities. This is encouraged. And they are immersed in a sensory experience of spaghetti and meatballs, and it's a lovely place to be. But as they grow, they're going to participate more in activities. They will help to scrape the scraps from the plates. They will help to put the plate and the cup in the appropriate place, remove their bibs, wash their hands, dry up, and tidy up after the meal. These are all actions that are waiting and that they will learn and develop. So the educator, she's very much aware of where the children are going to go in terms of how to behave in a meal time, but she's not rushing them towards these goals of perfect mealtime behaviour. And I've watched Spanish children at mealtimes, and they do behave pretty much perfectly. But instead, she enables interactions between children, she enables sensory enjoyment, and enables familiarisation with the mealtime routines. She praises help when they retrieve the spaghetti that's gone awry, and carefully selects the moments when she's going to intervene and shape the mealtime behaviour. So she, I would argue, is giving children the room to grow. And that fits within the particular context of that particular day nursery where this piece of practice was happening. So finally, we're going to whiz off to Croatia, where there was an observation about children who once were playing in the classroom basketball. Now, the teacher in this classroom wants the children to be able to pursue their own interests, such as basketball, but actually basketball in the classroom can get a little bit dangerous. So he thought of a different game that the children could play, golf. And the educator explains that golf actually isn't very well known in Croatia. It's quite exciting. And they devised a game, similar to golf, with scrunched up paper balls and a ladle, and the children really enjoyed this. They learned how to take turns, they understood the rules and actually then developed some new rules within their own group, and this game carried on for over a month with the children still finding new ways to develop and keep it interesting. So this is a different kind of an educator being child-centred within the particular context that he was working. So he seized the moment when the basketball was getting a little bit too dangerous for the context to change the direction of the children's activities to enable them to pursue their interests while keeping the environment safe and pleasant, facilitative and enabling for all. And a quote from the observation, recognising and facilitating opportunities to be part of something together, that's what he was aiming for, to feel part of a group experience while learning who they are as individuals. And this was at the centre of his practice of how he understood being a child-centred practitioner. So there's an interesting dynamic here between learning who you are as an individual in the context of being in a group with other people. And I think this was something that this particular activity actually promoted ideals that were close to the teacher's heart, but also really much kept up with the children's interests. So we suggest then that it's not only the knowledges about different kinds of discipline that practitioners need to know, that it's also knowledges about knowing when and then knowing how to put the book learning knowledges into action. So one of these ways is through observation itself, through the kind of pedagogical watchfulness or sensitivity or tact as Van Manen describes it. And this feels to me a bit like being situated in the part of the Venn diagram that's in tune with the romantic idea of child-centeredness. It's very much watching the child in their own world and knowing sensitively when to do something. That is informed by a knowledge of child development, and that can be formal knowledge from reading it from a book, but also from experience of being with children over a long period of time and getting a feel for when it might be that they might move on to something else. But also, and I'm going back again to the example from the Italian context, it's an understanding of the child's trajectory through the particular social cultural context that they find them in. And the child has a right to be able to succeed as they go through the system. And this is something that comes to me very much from my own role as a teacher of children with special educational needs, Is it enough to leave children in their own world with their own interests when you know that they're going to move on to the next stage and there are going to be more demands made of them? Is it actually not the role of the professional to in some way prepare them for that, to provide a bridge? And that, for me, is a democratic decision to make sure that you support the child, to shape them in a way that might enable them to succeed as they move through the system. So, just quickly now, we'd just like to mention that some aspects that came through from the survey in the third stage of the project. This is to show you that we had a rather uneven response from different educators across the 4 countries. And we really need to talk very carefully to the people in Spain to find out exactly what they did to get that fantastic response. And not surprisingly, in these contexts, it was a mainly female workforce, and over 60% of them had at least 10 years experience. So again, we're contacting the people who are perhaps more experienced. We're not necessarily getting the views of the people who are new to the profession. So this is actually their response to the outcomes of our nominal group technique and the way in which they, the level of importance they attributed to the things that we'd identified. And the top 4, I think, really capture an understanding of child development, of child-centeredness that goes beyond perhaps some of the individualities of context. So tuning into children's needs and interests, supporting children to explore and play, providing enabling playful environments, and collaboration with families. Those were the 4 things that most people thought were very important. That's what you get the big green bar from. And I thought you might also be interested to see how confident practitioners felt about supporting child-centred practice across the 6 countries. The most confidence levels of confidence came from Ireland. Italy was next, but we have some issues perhaps with the sample there, because we think we might have mainly got pedagogista rather than the practitioners in the settings. The other countries are perhaps more of a muchness. But Ireland has got confident practitioners regarding child-centeredness. So, to conclude, I think one thing that I take away from this is the extent to which practitioners, as part of their professional identity, are always thinking about the child's future. They're trying to leave that there now, but encourage you, if you were interested, to follow the project that we've completed and the one that we've just started through these links on Facebook, our website, which is up and running running smoothly, and also to access the free online training, should you wish to, which you can access through Open Plymouth, our Open Windows site. And if you just search on child-centred in the training, when you get to the training, you'll get our training and not some interesting stuff on sustainability in nursing. But I don't want to put you off that. And do you want to do a plug for the next project?
Just to say that the second phase of the project is looking more specifically at what a child-centred competence framework might look like for early childhood education and care. One of the things that we're quite conscious of is that I think the word competence in the English language is often seen as let's tick some boxes and show that somebody can do this. But if you go to France or Italy, their kind of interpretation of it is much more kind of holistic in its approach, and that's what we're looking to work towards. So continuing to work with Early Childhood Ireland, so those of you who are part of that will find out through that, and also the British Association of Early Education. Those are our 2 partners who will be coming up with the Child-Centred Competence Framework and presenting a series of online resources to support both students, so